You know, the 17th century in England was a time of absolutely radical change. As the worlds of science, politics, and religion were just being turned completely upside down, so was the very language people used to argue about it all. So today, we're going to explore that dramatic evolution of English prose during this, well, this incredibly turbulent period.
All right, so our journey through this century is going to have three key stops. First, we'll start with the scientific revolution and look at how it totally reshaped the very idea of truth. Then, we're diving straight into the heart of the Civil War, where prose became literally a political weapon. And finally, we'll see how this century wrapped up in a new age of reason and clarity.
So let's start at the beginning of the century, where this radical new way of thinking really started to take hold. It was a huge shift away from just accepting ancient authority and a move towards direct observation, and it was championed by these incredible minds like Francis Bacon.
Francis Bacon basically looked at the way knowledge had been gathered for centuries and said, you know what? This system is built on flawed foundations. He argued that to truly understand the world, we couldn't just rely on what old books told us. We needed a brand new, much more rigorous instrument for the mind.
So in his groundbreaking work, Novum Organum, Bacon lays out these two paths to knowledge. The old way, which he saw as a total dead end, started with these big, abstract ideas and then tried to force reality to fit them. But Bacon's true way did the exact opposite. It started small, with specific observations, things you could actually see and touch, and then carefully, gradually, built general truths from the ground up.
Now, to clear the path for this new way of thinking, Bacon identified four major roadblocks that he called idols, basically the biases that cloud our judgment. You've got the idols of the tribe, which are flaws common to all of us as humans, the idols of the cave, which are our own personal blind spots, the idols of the marketplace, which is confusion caused by messy language, and the idols of the theater, which are all the misleading dogmas from old philosophies we just accept without question. And this whole trend, this empirical way of looking at things, wasn't just for science. Thomas Hobbes took a similar dissecting lens to politics. He believed that if you wanted to build a stable society, you first had to understand its most basic building blocks, human beings. And what he saw? Well, he was a nature driven by this relentless, kind of scary mix of aggression, self-interest, and a deep fear of death. The famous title page of Hobbes's book Leviathan gives us this incredible visual for his core idea. You see the state as this single giant sovereign, but if you look closer, his body is made up of countless tiny individuals. They've all turned over their own will to this one entity, all in exchange for order and protection.
That Latin inscription you see above the figure, it translates to, "There is no power on earth to be compared to him." And for Hobbes, that was the bottom line. To escape the brutal chaos of a life that he called nasty, brutish, and short, society had to give absolute, unquestionable power to a sovereign. It was the only way to get security.
All right, so as we move into the middle of the century, things get, well, chaotic. England descends into civil war, and in this period, prose wasn't just a tool for philosophers anymore. It became the main weapon on the battlefield for the nation's very soul. Enter John Milton. You probably know him as the great poet, right? Well, for nearly 20 years, he completely dedicated himself to the parliamentary cause. He actually set aside poetry and used his powerful intellect to argue for religious and civil liberties in these fiery, really persuasive prose pamphlets. And you can see this ideological war playing out perfectly in print right after the king's execution. The royalists published Eikon Basilika, which means the royal image, painting the dead king as a martyr. So, Parliament commissions Milton to write a rebuttal, Iconoclastus, which literally means the image breaker, a systematic, paragraph-by-paragraph demolition of that royalist propaganda. But, you know, his most enduring prose work has to be Areopagitica. It is this thunderous defense of free speech. And what's wild is that he wrote it as a plea against Parliament's own censorship laws. It's all built around this incredibly powerful foundational argument for the freedom of the press. So while Milton was writing for this highly educated, politically savvy audience, another Puritan voice emerged from a totally different world. John Bunyan was a preacher, and he was actually imprisoned for his faith, but he spoke directly to the spiritual journey of the common person. And from his jail cell, Bunyan wrote The Pilgrim's Progress, which would go on to become one of the most influential books in English literature, period. Using the simple allegory of a journey, it maps out all the profound spiritual challenges and temptations that an everyman, named Christian, faces on his path to salvation. So,
After all that turmoil, the Civil War, the interregnum, when the monarchy is finally restored in 1660, there's just this huge collective sigh of relief, right? And with it came this profound desire for stability, for order, for clarity, and for reason in pretty much everything.
And this wasn't just a vibe, you know? This desire for clarity actually got institutionalized. The newly founded Royal Society, which was dedicated to advancing science, basically mandated a prose style for its members that had to be precise, plain, and direct. And this new standard, it would end up influencing all kinds of writing. And really, if you want to talk about who best represents this new age, you've got to talk about John Locke. His work on government and human understanding gave a direct and really powerful counterargument to the absolutism that Hobbes had been pushing for decades earlier.
So in his 2 treatises of government, Locke basically flips the script. He argued that a legitimate government isn't absolute at all. It's actually founded on a contract with the people who agree to be governed in order to protect their natural rights, what he called life, liberty, and property.
And right here you have it, the central political debate of the entire century, laid out plain as day. On one side, you've got Hobbes, arguing for security through an absolute ruler. And on the other, you've got Locke, defending liberty through a government that's based on the consent of the people it governs.
Okay, so finally, let's look at the world of literature itself. This same spirit of rational, clear-headed analysis, well, it gets applied to the art of writing by none other than John Dryden, who's really considered the father of modern literary criticism.
His essay of dramatic poesy, this was a landmark work. He used this really cool conversational dialogue format to debate all the major literary questions of his day. And in doing so, he argued for the very same unadorned, clear prose that the Royal Society was promoting for science.
So when you step back and you look at the whole century, what you really see is this fundamental transformation of English prose. It evolved from being a vessel for old, ancient certainties into the primary tool for actually investigating experience, for debating liberty, and for building a new, more rational world.
And that really leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it? The foundational questions these writers wrestled with about the nature of truth, the rights of the individual, and the proper limits of state power, they aren't just relics of the past. They are still at the very heart of our own modern debates.